All right, then. Let's start. Hi, and welcome, everyone. Welcome, everyone, to our series Transatlantic Voices, Stimmen aus Amerika in Zeiten von Corona, with today's topic, Protest for Progress, hashtag Black Lives Matter. The national uprisings during these past few weeks in response to the murder of George Floyd has been met with shock, elation, concern, fear, and gestures of solidarity across the world. Fact is, however, what happened to George Floyd is just the tip of the iceberg. Again, last week, another Black man, Rayshard Brooks, was shot at Wendy's drive-thru in Atlanta, Georgia. Across the United States and cities large and small, streets have filled with young, multiracial crowds who have had enough. The anger and bitterness at racist and unrestrained police violence, abuse, and murder have finally spilled over in every corner of the United States. And today, we want to talk about these problems and protests, which will hopefully lead to changes in the US society. And we couldn't have picked a better day for our discussion today, because today is Juneteenth. June 19th is the oldest known celebration, which commemorates the belated announcement of the Emancipation Proclamation and the effective end of slavery in 1865, nearly 2.5 years later. As America experiences a national reckoning on race, more and more people are amplifying the history behind Juneteenth and its connection to modern issues such as police brutality and economic inequality all over the country. So on social media and schools and local government, people use Freedom Day to describe this day, to focus on African American history, hope, and victory over struggle and barriers. My name is Katharina Kiefel, and I'm the program manager at Amerika House. For those of you who never heard about us, Amerika House is based here in Cologne, in Germany. We organize events in politics, culture, economics, and education, and we are a transatlantic NGO. With me on this call are these wonderful people that I've met last year during our program with AICGS, American Institute for Contemporary German Studies, in Akron, Ohio. And this is Marcela Berrientos, Dillon Cathro, and the Director of Programs and Grants, Susanne Dieper. So she will introduce our program and how we met in a minute. Welcome, guys, and thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you, Susanne and AICGS, for supporting us. Also, I would like to thank our team, Ian and Dr. Benjamin Becker in the background for handling things. Thank you so much, guys, for being there for me. And before we start, however, I would like to mention some technical details real quick. And dear audience, we highly encourage you to engage in our conversation with your questions. So in order to do so, you have two possibilities. Number one, if you want to ask a question in person, please click on the hand button down below, and we can then pass the virtual mic to you. And you will have to click on mute to speak up. If you do so, please introduce yourself shortly to the audience. Number two, if you want to send us a question in writing, please click on the Q&A or the F&A button down below to type the question. We can then read it out loud for our guests, and especially for those who are joining us via phone, because they cannot ask questions, unfortunately. And please note, and this is very important, this call is on the record. It will be recorded and published later on our social media channels. And now I would like to hand over the virtual mic to you, Susanne.
Yes, thank you, Katharina, for the introduction and for including AICGS in this program today. Good morning, good afternoon to everybody. As Katharina mentioned, she, Marcela, and Dillon are participants in an AICGS project on social divisions and questions of identity in the US and Germany. It's a 3-year program that brings together a group of Germans and Americans of different backgrounds to look at some of the underlying factors of the division, polarization, both our societies are experiencing. And those, of course, include social, demographic, economic, and geographic factors, as well as identity dynamics in our diverse societies. The program is funded by the ERP Transatlantic program at the German Federal Ministry of Economic Affairs, and it aims to engender an honest and open exchange on issues that I think we all agree can be uncomfortable and difficult at times. And with the program, we hope not only to bring people together, but also to offer compromise and possibly solutions so that the existing divide can be somewhat narrowed or even closed. What's interesting about the program, I think, is that the exchanges, at least the personal exchanges, take place in smaller cities outside of major metropolitan areas. And the first year brings us to Akron, Ohio, and its German sister city, Chemnitz in Saxony. Unfortunately, COVID-19 has interrupted our travels a bit. We have not quite made it to Chemnitz yet, but the program continues online, and I think the effort to communicate seems to be increasingly important, especially given the three crises we find ourselves in at the moment, and we feel it particularly acutely in the US: the coronavirus, the economic fallout from the pandemic, and the issue over racial inequality and discrimination that do exist in both our societies. So I'm really pleased, and I speak also on behalf of the AICGS, that the Amerika House is continuing the discussion on an important issue, and I look forward to the exchange today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susan. Thank you for introducing the program. Now I'd like to go over and introduce also our guests. So I start with Marcela, and Marcela Berrientos is the interim executive director at the New York Civic Engagement Table, NYCET. She is a proud immigrant who was born in Honduras and raised in New York City. Love that phrase. Marcela has an extensive background working in the labor movement as a strategic campaigner, organizer, and trainer. Prior, Marcela was hired as the first director of organizing for the AFL-CIO's Latino constituency group, where she traveled throughout the country meeting with Latino union members, students, and allies to organize around issues impacting their communities. She has also taught courses in social justice and theater at community college and university levels. Dillon Cathro works as the director of youth organizing for 482 Forward, an education justice nonprofit organization in Detroit, Michigan. He graduated from St. Olaf College in 2017 with a double major in social work and French. After teaching English in France, Dillon completed his master's on social work, specializing in interpersonal practice with children, youth, and families. Throughout the Ullman Freud Fellowship, Dillon worked on a program to evaluate the extent to which students in the LGBTQIA community felt affirmed and welcomed in their profession. Furthermore, Dillon was also a member of the Sexual Misconduct Education and Structuring Working Group, as well as the Sexual Misconduct Advisory Board. And once again, welcome, guys. I'm very happy to have you here and see you again. It's so nice to see you.
Very happy to be here. Thank you.
So, as it's a part of our series, I would like to start with general questions. And Marcela, during the height of the pandemic, we spent a lot of time on the phone. And I was joining your 7 o'clock NY clap, which was, by the way, beautiful to see, especially from Manhattan. And yeah, you joined also ours in Cologne. But also besides that, you were sending me videos of police brutality and how they were beating and arresting Black people in the streets just for not keeping the social distance. As a true Yorker, being in the epicenter of a pandemic and now in the middle of the protest, can you tell us about what you've experienced in the past few weeks?
Sure, and months.
Yeah, and months already. Yes, please.
First of all, I just want to say thank you for inviting me and Dillon. And I'm going to try this out. So for my German brothers and sisters, Guten Tag, alle zusammen.
Hi.
I hope
that was a good one. Good for that.
I'm trying here. I'm trying. No, but I think what's been very interesting in the United States, and particularly New York, is that COVID-19 really lifted the veil on a already rotten system. Often when folks think about the United States, we think about the myth of it, right? It's the country where you can dream big and have it happen. Well, really, if we dig a little deeper in history, we know that this country was founded on genocide and slavery. So to know that that is our foundation, it's only a matter of time before there is a deep reckoning. And we've been here before. We know the civil rights movement had the same challenge, had the same state violence presented when they resisted and they asked for change that we're seeing now. So New York has been particularly interesting because I think it in many ways, it reflects a lot of the trends that are happening across the country. Income inequality is incredibly high. We have some of the most segregated neighborhoods in all of the country. We have an electoral system, policy rules that are somewhat reflective of states that are in the South. And again, we're New York. We do have the best pizza though, I'm just gonna say that. But, so I think that for our nation and in New York in particular, the veil has been lifted. We knew that state violence was prevalent in not just the killings of Black folks, but also mass incarceration, unjust policies that target communities of color at far greater rates than any other community in this country. And so all of this kind of has come together. Add to that income inequality where people are losing their jobs, and COVID, which really highlighted the inequality in our healthcare system. And I spoke to a lot of friends during this time, especially in New York, and I had one friend whose partner is a resident in a hospital, in an emergency room to be precise. And we were FaceTiming, and she said his belief is not that COVID killed this many people, it's that our crumbling infrastructure and our governor who has slashed our healthcare system and the budget for years on end killed people. We were ill prepared for a crisis. So you're seeing all of these elements, as Suzanne pointed out, these three elements, right? COVID, economic inequality, racial inequality, converge, and the rotten system is starting to crack. So this is I call it a transformational moment. When I think about the uprisings that have been taking place, it's the people's uprising. It was time. And I feel that many of us have been waiting for this moment. And I think the question that we're interested in asking is, how do we make sure that this movement and this energy continues to transform the systems, our worldview, even down to how we are thinking about what the US is and what we stand for. So we'll see, but New York pizza is still good. So.
All right, so I jump right away to Dillon. And Dillon, you live in a city, you live in Detroit with a long, difficult history on the racial conflict and segregation. 80% of Detroit's population is African American. How have you experienced the protests in your city? And can you see any progress in the protesters' demands?
So it's been really interesting in Detroit, right? And I want to make it very clear that I'm not a Detroiter. I'm not from Detroit. I'm from Nebraska, right? So I'm very much looking at what's been going on from a third point of view. But similar to New York, Detroit's no stranger to discrimination. We've been during the 2008 recession, known as the Great Recession here in the States, an already crumbling housing market fell into a void. Right, where now we have third party buyers coming in, taking up homes, selling them to financially averse or financially unstable families in dilapidated states. And then when they have to file bankruptcy and lose their homes, they get paid out by the state, right? And so it's a nefarious system where we're not helping people maintain their homes. We're not helping people actually gain a net income, right? And grow both financially and also socially, right? We're keeping people down because it's profitable to keep people poor, right? And so, and then additionally, throughout these past 3 months with the pandemic, I work in education, right? And so, I'm not sure what it was like in Germany, but here in the States, I don't think anybody was prepared for virtual learning. I don't think anyone was prepared.
It was the same here. It was the same.
Yeah, I don't think anyone was prepared to have their kids home all the time, and to homeschool your kids, and no one was. And so, and it, like Marcela said, this pandemic shed a light on an already crumbling system and an already exacerbated rate of discrimination and poverty and lack of resources and refusal of resources, right? How do you expect students to learn to continue along this traditional path of education if they don't have internet or Wi-Fi at home? They don't have computers, if they might have one phone per family, if they live in a family of maybe 10 people in a household, when people are sick, when they might be in a mixed status family where they don't have the luxury to not work, but they also don't want to leave the home, because if they leave the home, not only are they risking their health, they're also risking being detained by ICE, which is Immigration Customs Enforcement, right? It's a whole thing that similar to New York, we didn't have any preparation for, and our government failed to help us, right? We were slow to act nationally, but also statewide. So getting to these protests, I think what happened is over these past, over this, since the beginning of this country, people of color, communities of color we've protested, we've voiced our concerns, we've voiced our needs, and our rights, and these protests kind of served to give us an outlet and a funnel for our demands for justice. The issue in Detroit is that we have a lot of different protests going on, and it's been unclear as to which way they're going, and I think that's a national conversation we're having too. The overall rhetoric of police brutality being bad, that there needs to be reform or doing away with police, it's happening, right? But but when we're talking about alternatives to policing, when we're talking about restorative justice practices, when we're talking about really getting to the foundation of why we have a system of discrimination in place and why it exists and what it's tied to and why we have a military police, a lot of people in Detroit aren't ready to have the conversation about what a police-free state looks like. So it's really, what happens is you have a lot of the young people saying, get rid of the police, but not all of them know what that means. You have older populations of people, populations of color, BIPOC people, saying, we need better police, but we still need police, right? And so that's an ongoing conversation, and we are making strides in that conversation, but it's difficult because you have to bring everybody to the table, and not everybody's ready to have that conversation.
Yeah, that's so true. I mean, and just staying there with the defund the police movement, what people used to call it, like we just hear snippets, here and there, Instagram, social media, whatever you want to call it, and nobody actually knows what does that actually mean, defunding and abolishing the police, and where should this money go to? Yeah. What are your thoughts on that?
You want to take that first, Marcela?
Sure, because I think there's a fundamental question that we have to ask ourselves, and Dillon is right. There is a shift in consciousness and worldview that has to take place for us to really understand and imagine what would a defunded police department in every city look like. But I think the fundamental question here is, who do the police protect? Who do the police serve? And in my opinion, in many ways, historically, police departments have served to protect property. And looking at New York, talking money here, the NYPD has a budget of $5.6 billion. That is more money than the following programs put together: housing, youth programs, homeless services, and health agencies combined.
Well,
I these numbers are a question about our value system. What do we value? And I think one of the things that was really interesting about the state response to some of the uprisings is, in spite of witnessing the murder of an innocent Black man on a video for 8 minutes and having the arrests made immediately of his murderers, it took 4 days and broken windows and burned cars for those arrests to be made. And then the focus was on the broken windows and the burned cars. So who are police departments supposed to serve? And let's think about it. Let's just ask ourselves for a minute. If there's a domestic violence call, should it be police officers that arrive or social workers? How are we really elevating our values, and what are they? And how do we then tie the funding to reflect our values? Because as of now, I'm thinking, I don't know if this is what I'm signing up for.
Yeah, and returning to that, I mean, you know, I've read a lot of articles where cities across the US have been finding new ways to respond to social problems that they don't solely rely on sending in armed cops. And these cities want to replace cops with social workers, Dillon, for example, and medics and people without guns. These problems haven't received a lot of attention, but nonetheless, they're still there, right? And cities have been working on local alternative approaches to issues cops seem least equipped to deal with, including what you just mentioned, mental health crisis, homelessness, traffic issue, drugs, sex work, and so on. I mean, the list is long. And for you, Dillon, as a social worker, what is your approach to this way of defunding, or like how would you like to change that or not? Like, what do you think about that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And you know, what's interesting about social workers is that we, in this day and age, in the last like 20 years, I think social workers have been really trying to change our reputation because we've often been known as child snatchers. So for folks in welfare situations who are losing their kids because of, you know, problems that they've been having, or we've been known as, we've been known for a lot of nefarious things, like the Native American internment camps, right, and the Native American boarding schools, right. So we've played our part as well in systematic discrimination, and so social workers have to do their own work. But the reason that social workers are well placed to replace police is that good social workers and other mental health and wellness-based workers base their work in restorative justice. Restorative justice means you don't approach a problem with a punitive lens to punish or reprimand someone for something that they've done, right? Because the whole point of restorative justice is for there to be learning so that a problem doesn't persist. What we found with police is that as strong as they come, you know, with the beatings, with the mass incarceration, with the killings, the quote unquote crimes that they're trained to stop don't stop, right? What police are supposed to do is to remove an immediate threat, not to address a systemic problem. Yeah. And they are the systemic problem, police, right? So in my organization, we've been working on getting school police out of Detroit public schools, right? And a lot of parents and students have had pushback on that, saying, well, what happens if a kid brings a gun to school? What happens if there's a fight? Well, why do kids bring guns to schools? Why is there a fight? We're addressing a stimulus, not the reason for which it happens in the first place. And there's no doubt in my mind that we need safety in schools, just like we need safety in our communities. But it has never made sense to bring in a third party to a situation that they're not familiar with, to a community that they're not familiar with, instead of having community members take care of themselves. You know, instead of having, for example, in our proposal to defund school police and in our campaign, we are asking to, as a first demand, to divest from the $10 million budget we have just for school police. Just for school police in our, yes, just for school police in Detroit public schools, we have upwards of $10 million for the police department, for the Detroit Public Schools Police Department. And they're armed police, right? So a first demand is to divest 50%, $5 million from that budget, and to put it into cultural liaisons, meaning people that come from the communities that make up the school are hired into the school and then have an inside look into the interpersonal conflicts that might happen between students and resolve it themselves. To have more social workers who are trauma informed and based in restorative practices, who are also representative of the communities in Detroit. Not these people that come from Ann Arbor or from more affluent suburbs, right? Because they're not part of this community. They don't understand the context, right? So being a social worker doesn't mean that you can save the world, right? But being a social worker from the community means not only do you have personal credibility with the people you're working with, you have more training to help people help themselves, essentially. Because if you're a good social worker, you're about empowerment, not reform.
Yeah.
So the question is that we really have to wrestle with in schools and outside of schools is, what does safety mean? And like Marcela was saying, who are we talking about when we're talking about safety or defense? What are the police for? To whom do we give protection and to whom do we give punishment? And more often than not, there are so many studies out there that correlate the presence of police in schools to the school to prison pipeline. And if we're using police as our main form of discipline and upholding discipline in our schools, when that really should be our teachers, since they have much more relationships with our students, then we're just going to have a continual reality of kids going to jail and of kids' dreams of killing the dreams of students in schools and then killing their bodies outside of schools.
Thank you. I mean, the audience, if you would like to engage, you're more than welcome to do so. So if you have any questions, just raise your hand or write them down into the Q&A or F&A button. And what you've mentioned before is that there are certainly mixed feelings about the police and whether to abolish them or just to keep them or just to keep the things the way they are, right? And there's a huge population, mostly white people, that are saying we need the police and we don't want to change anything. We need that law and order, what people are kind of saying pretty often in the past few weeks or days. How can you convince mostly the white population on this change?
I don't think it's about convincing. You know, these systems have taken generations to be put in place and sustained. This work is going to take generations to dismantle and undo and really shift the thinking of, again, what we value. And I think part of, you know, when I ask myself, should we be investing in, or in other words, should we be providing tax dollars to police departments to purchase rocket launchers, because that's a thing, or investing in our school system, which we don't think twice about cutting their funding. We don't think twice about cutting our healthcare. So I think that this is going to take time. And part of what has happened is the question of whose lives do we matter? Whose lives matter, right? And with the Black Lives Matter movement, there's been an interconnectedness of humanity. And we're seeing that in the protests, we're seeing that in the rallies of our liberation is tied to each other. So we have to begin to question the systems that divide us, that are killing Black people, and imagine alternatives. That is unnerving. That takes work, especially when every institution that we are part of perpetuates the opposite. White supremacy is woven into everything we do in the United States. It's in the air that we breathe. And so I think that we have to be prepared for the work, the patience, the time, and also not letting up. Even if we win elections, even if we win policy, we have to keep going.
And here's a question from Ronnie Rodriguez, who's asking, do you believe it is possible for America to move forward absent reparations for slavery?
In my opinion, no. I'm all for reparations.
Yeah. And there's a raised hand.
And I think Susanna has a question too.
Yeah, from Benjamin Becker too. Oh, okay, Benjamin, you can speak up now.
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, first of all, congratulations on such a great discussion thus far, and wow, thanks a lot for committing for this intercultural exchange. I have a maybe that's on a meta level. It's a large question. Maybe you can't answer it, but I'm still trying it. I mean, there have been several attempts at change on different levels, and some people. I mean, this feeling of fatigue has been cited so many times. So I'm tired of all of this. Do you think that this time will be different? And if so, why? Thank you very much.
I think that's a really good question. And I think that's kind of on us, right? I think what has happened in the past, and Marcela will probably have much better, more insightful things to say than I do. But it's just as you said, Benjamin, that fatigue takes in, one, and two, what's not covered on the news is that the state does a lot of things to suppress our movements. For example, after Mike Brown died in Ferguson, a lot of the main leaders of those protests and of that movement, when Black Lives Matter was first getting started, ended up dead. Not missing, dead. And that's happened throughout our history. Whether that be the death of Fred Hampton or the implanting different federal agents within movements to create riots, and most recently in the current quote unquote riots that the media have covered, those have been started not by the protesters, but by white supremacists, by people paid to create a fuss, by undercover cops, which then runs the risk of us losing credibility and for being labeled as criminals, as rioters, as, and so the message gets lost. And so I think for this to make a difference, for this to really be ongoing and to create systemic change, we can't stop after the president writes a little law about outlawing chokeholds, unless there was a caveat in that law. President Trump signed a law outlawing chokeholds unless the police feel that their lives are threatened, which is exactly why George Zimmerman got off with Trayvon Martin, right? Which means the cops can still use them. And so we have to stay united, just like Marcela said, and we have to maintain a focus and also keep on reassessing our focus, right? Continuing to do process evaluations of where we're going, where we started, where we are, and where we're going, to make sure that any movement that we're trying to generate is inclusive, intergenerational, intersectional, and pertinent to what we're actually trying to get.
Marcela, would you like to add something?
Yeah, I just have to say, I sat next to Dillon the whole week we were in Akron. I'm like, I miss him.
That's true.
Benjamin, your question is the question of the day. And by that, I mean every day. Everybody who's part of the progressive left is constantly asking, how do we engage this energy? How do we move it? And I think one of the things that I particularly love about the Black Lives movement is that it's decentralized. There isn't one leader, there isn't one elected official, there isn't one voice. It's a collective group of people who have decided enough is enough. So to answer this question, and it might sound a little, hippy dippy, but to be honest with you, I think that the people who are going to transform this nation and the world, because remember, US foreign policy parallels a lot of what we're seeing in the US, it's gonna be the everyday people. It's gonna be the janitors. It's gonna be the grocery store workers. It's gonna be the teachers. It's gonna be the lawyers. It's gonna be the students. It's gonna be your neighbors. It's gonna be your friends. It's gonna be you. That's what we have to make clear. This isn't about waiting for the plan to arrive. It's not about saying, okay, here's one solution, because again, if white supremacy impacts every piece of our society, we have to attack it as such. As Dillon said, even in social work, in that industry, there's white supremacy, and there has to be a shift in thinking. In our political system, there has to be a shift and transformation. In schools, you know, civics education was phased out of public education in the 1970s. And then you have No Child Left Behind that came through in the 2000s that really was just like, teach it if you want. So we literally have generations of Americans who don't even know how the systems work, who are denied their own history. I can't tell you the number of youth that I've worked with who, when we talk about social justice movements like the civil rights movements, the Chicano movements, the Young Lords, have said to me, why don't they teach us this in school? So there's so much work to do, but it's going to be the everyday people who will sustain this work, big or small. And I think managing expectations, but dreaming big, is part of what we have to be committed to.
Thank you. Thank you so much. There's another question, Dillon, for you. It's just, yeah, Jan Christoph Pelt asked, Dillon, is there a general awareness in the US about restorative practices? Is the country ready for this?
My answer to that is ready or not, here we come. You know, because I think there are many people in this country that are not ready for restorative justice because it's hard. Like that's an excellent question, actually. So before this role, before this role, I worked as a sexual misconduct case manager, meaning I worked with people on a college campus who had been harmed in an interpersonal relationship, and they were trying to figure out what to do. And one of the interventions that we did was a restorative justice intervention with the person accused of harm and the person who had received that harm. Now, the only way that that process works is if both parties agree to come together to talk about the harm that has been committed. And that's really hard to do in any traumatic experience. So restorative justice necessarily needs all parties involved, not most importantly, but very importantly, including the people that are killing Black and brown bodies, including the people that are taking away our homes, our kids, who are defunding our schools to create more prisons, who are currently, and have never stopped, putting little babies in cages, still, throughout this country, not just on the Mexico-US border. And there's a reckoning that needs to happen that I don't think people are ever really ready for, because it's really hard to look yourself in the mirror and say, ooh, I've done some nasty stuff. But that's what healing looks like, you know? And, you know, that's not unique to the States, but it's a big problem. And just like Marcela said, part of an area where that can start is in schools. We should be talking about the Young Lords. We should be talking about Corky Gonzalez. We should be talking about Ruben Salazar. All these people, and Dolores Huerta, and like all these people throughout history who have been fighting for what we're talking about today for much longer than we realize. And yet, whenever big movements like this start, a lot of people, Black, brown, blue, or orange, doesn't matter where you come from, say, wow, I didn't know this, you know? And restorative justice has always been needed, and it's kind of shown up in different pockets of history when there is a chance for change. But ready or not, we have to do it. Otherwise, we're gonna have the same conversation year after year after year after year.
Oh, I mean, great. Thanks to the audience for so many questions. And thank you, Dillon. And Christoph Phelps, went back to you. Yes, is there someone else?
Katharina, may I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
I'll put myself on video.
Yeah.
I wanted to come back to the question of defunding the police. And do you think that the issue of gun rights, extremely lax gun restrictions in the U.S. play play a role. And I mean, the US is a lethal country. And maybe the reason why we don't see violence from the police as much in Germany or other countries has something to do with that. And I wonder if this issue of gun rights has to be tackled at the same time to really make a difference.
I would say yes. And I think there are two issues that I see within that. You know, you have the culture of gun rights in this country, just like Susanna said, that I don't know if we'll ever be able to extricate that. One thing I think we could do is cease the relationship between local police and the Defense Department, where they get all of their arms. The reason that police have access to Kevlar vests, rocket launchers, semi-automatic rifles is not because they're furnished in the state that they're in. It's because they have a contract with defense contractors and the Defense Department, who sells those arms to the states, right? And so it makes no sense for police officers to have access to tanks, to have access to these type of weapons. So I think, yeah, we need to talk about gun culture, but we also have to talk about access to military-based weapons of our local police officers.
But I would say it's not just the police, it's the general population who has access to these guns. So if I were a police officer, I don't think I'd want to go into a domestic violence situation without being armed.
Totally.
So it's kind of a vicious circle, no?
Yes. Yes, it is.
Yeah, and the thought of that also is terrifying.
I got scared just thinking about that. Yeah.
No. It's terrifying to think that a police officer will require a gun, even in a domestic violence situation. Why aren't we talking about training around de-escalation? Why aren't we talking about what if I do walk into a situation where people are armed? And then let's really ask ourselves, who are the majority of people who have guns in this country? What's their demographic makeup? So I think, again, it's this constant consciousness shifting of this attachment to we meet force with force. Yet, when the left does it, it's bad. That's not how you should ask for equality and justice. You know? So I push back on that a little bit because it's disconcerting, right? Like, we should be able to propose different ways of thinking. How do we de-escalate? And I think many of these murderers have a lot to do with both the institution itself being rotten with white supremacy and the fact that you have these, to degree, young men of all races in the police force who respond to situations out of fear and violence and haven't had the training of de-escalation, of talking through, calming down. And I'm not saying it's always going to be that way, but fundamentally we do need gun control in the country. Until then, I think we need to think of other ways to respond to violence. Because Dillon Ruth, or I think that's his name, the shooter who shot up a black church, he walked out alive.
Yeah.
There's exceptions to the rule when police officers feel afraid and when they don't, and who they feel afraid from and who they don't.
Yeah, just adding, and there are so many questions. I just picked like the last one, the Catherine. I mean, they're all great, but this kind of fits as well for the near future. Many of us have concern from Catherine Castellanos, if I pronounce it right. Many of us have concerned ourselves with what September will look like when schools start again, rightfully. So given the pandemic, I question, what will education look like? We need new history books and materials that Black and Brown children can identify with. What do you think that will be? Do you think that will be possible? If so, for how long?
So the second part of our demands for defunding the police was also to create a community committee based of parents, students, teachers, and community and other community members, not only to talk about the process of defunding school police and finding alternative measures for safety and wellness work. It was also to instill anti-racist practices into our school systems, including changing our curriculum so that it's reflective of our communities and of our shared history, you know, both the good, the bad, and the ugly, and everything in between, right? And so what needs to happen is that we have to stop treating communities and schools as if they're two separate things, right? Our communities are what make up our schools. If without our surrounding communities, without our parents, our students, our loved ones, everybody that surrounds the community, schools wouldn't exist. So it makes no sense that the curriculum that our students are learning isn't informed by the people that are sending them to schools, right? And so what we want to do is to have parents at the table, to have students and other community members at the table to do exactly what this question is asking, if I'm understanding it right, is to talk about the curriculum as it is in our schools and to make it more reflective of what we should be learning and what we have a right to learn about our shared history and our contributions to this country as well.
Great. Yeah, Marcela?
Not really quickly. I can't remember which state in the Southwest. It's either Arizona or New Mexico. I might be wrong. But in one of those states, there was an ethnic studies program that developed for high school students with the intention of literally providing access to brown and black kids about their histories.
Cut it off.
And what was the city response to that? They canceled the program because it promoted hate. Wow. There is the information to our communities is so threatening that if we learn how we have been able for generations to not just survive, but to resist and affect change, it's too much. We got to shut it down.
Mm-hmm.
Well, now you're in the middle of a pandemic. You're in the middle of a protest for equality and against racism. And also there is an upcoming election. Let's just shift a little bit to the topic of the presidential election. And as the US is now like within 4 months of it, what do these protests against racism, police brutality, and systematic violence mean for Donald Trump and his crisis management? Can protests change election outcomes or the future of the parties? Isn't it just the right time for a fundamental change?
It's always the right time for a fundamental change.
Yeah.
You know, I'm a news junkie, and so I read the New York Times and the Guardian and a bunch of other, other stuff, and I am just concerned as I always have been that Trump will be reelected, because protests don't equal votes, and what I'm also worried about is that the progress and the momentum of these protests will only further incentivize the state to increase its voter suppression practices. For example, I don't know if you saw in the news, but Michigan, for all registered voters within the state, we are allowing people to vote from home, to apply to a vote from home. So they have to apply for an absentee ballot, right? So you get a ballot sent to you, get this application sent to your home, you fill it out, and then during a primary election or during the presidential election, instead of going to a polling place, your ballot will come to you and you mail it back in, right? It's very accessible, and it's a really great way for people who have issues of mobility or transportation or work to be able to vote and participate in this process. And what did Trump do? Oh, he said it was illegal. Oh, he said that, nope, we can't be doing this. He tried to block it, right? And that it's a constant fear, because the more you increase access to voting, the less likely he's going to win, right? In Detroit, we had some of the lowest voter turnouts in not only in the state but in the country, because of voter suppression, and also people didn't vote because a lot of folks don't believe in this voting system, right? Because even if you vote for someone like a dream, like for a lot of people, Obama was a dream, you know, he didn't work out super well for everybody. Mm-hmm. And so there's a lot of disenchantment, but in order for us to get number 45 out of office, we need people to show up, and we also need to make sure that people are being protected in their right to vote.
Yeah.
You know?
Voter suppression is a huge topic in the US, and voting is the absolute foundation of democracy. And last week, when I talked to my friends in Atlanta, Georgia, and they had the primaries, right? One could see impossibly long lines in the parade machines, understaffed voting sites, unavailable absentee ballots, like all these stuff and problems caused a chaotic, uncertain, and unfair election, I think, in my opinion. And to the surprise of no one, these problems were also most acute for African American voters, right? And Marcela, I think that's your topic, and I think you have a lot to say.
A little bit. No. So first I want to begin with a quote from Alicia Garza, one of the co-founders of Black Lives Matters. And she said, "Voting will not bring us liberation." And I completely agree with her. Voting is part of the overall strategy to undo these systems. But before we get into current day voter suppression, I love grounding ourselves in the history of this country, right? So I'm going to be looking down a little bit because I wanted to make sure I wrote some of this out. So to be very clear, the electoral work that I do centers itself in justice. Why? Because for far too long, Black, Indigenous, and communities of color have been denied their vote. So we're going to go back in time a little bit. So Native Americans, people who were on this land well before anybody else, weren't granted citizenship until 1924. And even then, it wasn't until 1948 that a law was passed that said that they could vote in every state. And even then, there were some states who didn't allow it. The last state to grant voting rights to Native Americans was Utah in 1962. So when we talk about the civil rights movement and the impact that it had on our voting rights in this country, and people say, people literally died for the right to vote, that is not an exaggeration. When I say the names of James Chaney, Michael Schwerner, and Andrew Goodman, who were 3 Freedom Summer youth who drove down to Mississippi to register Black people in the South to vote, they were murdered by the Ku Klux Klan. This is the history that we stand on. So that when we fast forward to 1965 and we are able to win the Voting Rights Act, which literally made sure to eliminate the voter suppression by states that implemented literacy tests, where, for example, Alabama distributed a literacy test that had, I think, over 60 questions. You couldn't get one wrong if you wanted to vote. Poll taxes, where you had to pay a certain amount of money to be able to vote. Police intimidation, economic retaliation. If you vote, you might lose your job. So when we think about the historical context, and then we fast forward to the 2000s, and we have the Supreme Court case Shelby versus Holder, which basically said, thanks to the terrible human that was Anthony Scalia, and somewhere may he rest because he died, basically gave corporations the blank check to spend as much money as they want on our elections. So after 2013, it is fair to say that corporations are paying our candidates to run. Candidates are not running for the people. And then in 2010, there was, that was the Citizens United, not case, I misquoted the wrong case. Shelby was actually, in 2013, the one that gutted the Voting Rights Act. So all of those protections from the Voting Rights Act are gutted. And 2016 was the first time that we had a presidential election without the VRA fully intact. And what happened? We began to see states requesting voter IDs. We began to see states clearing out voter rolls because, you haven't voted in the past 2 elections, so you have to re-register. All of these interesting things coming back up. In Florida in 2018, formerly incarcerated people with felonies prior to 2018 lost their right to vote. In 2018, through a ballot initiative during the midterm election, they were able to restore their right to vote. And what did the Republican legislature do in Florida? They turned around and said, oh no, you can only vote if you pay all of the court fees that are outstanding. Well, gee whiz, that sounds a lot like a poll tax to me. So when we talk about voting in this country, it is not a one person, one vote thing. We have an antiquated electoral college system, which is really how Trump won in 2016. And we have states that are actively trying to suppress voters. The fact that in Wisconsin, the governor wanted to extend the absentee ballot deadline because there was a pandemic. It is dangerous to stand on a line because you might get sick. And that case made it all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, not a big deal. People can go out and vote in person. That tells us something. You want us to literally put our lives at risk to cast a ballot? In Georgia, knowing the impact of COVID on elders, one of the polling sites was a nursing home. It is not an exaggeration when we say that in this country, people have died for the right to vote, and we're still here. So as we go into the 2020 election, I have some show and tell stuff for you, because I think New York, we have this perception of being really progressive, and a lot of the systems in place for absentee ballot that Dillon described are accurate. We have to apply for it. Then, are you guys ready for this? You might get a ballot in the mail the size of this.
Oh my God.
I'm not exaggerating. And then you get 2 envelopes where you put your ballot in here, and then you put it in the other, right? Okay, well, let's think about this. Only 3% of New Yorkers are on the actual permanent absentee ballot list. That means 97% have seldom or never have voted using an absentee ballot. And I do this work, and it's still confusing. Our infrastructure for our Board of Elections is weak. Right now in New York City, there's about a 200,000 absentee ballot application backlog, and our primary is June 23rd. We have early voting in New York, which means you can vote 10 days before the election. So some of our groups purposely went to check things out. And you are legally allowed to drop off your absentee ballot in person at a poll site. And guess what? Poll workers told them, no, you can't. You can't do that. There was also another instance where ballots were mailed out in Spanish to English-speaking households. There were folks who only received one of these envelopes. Now, this is the part that kills me. Let's say I get hungry and I'm filling out my ballot and I spill a little something on it, or I might make a little note on it. That could cause for my ballot to be invalidated, making my vote not being able to count anymore. When we talk about voting in this country, we have to talk about the history of voter suppression and what we will be up against going into the 2020 election. We have just seen the beginnings of it. And our side is doing the best that we can to make sure that people have resources and access to information and guidance on what to do throughout the process. However, the Republican National Committee has already been training 50,000 poll workers that they are intending to place in swing states. If history tells us anything, I don't think these poll workers want certain groups of people to vote. The second thing, we've already seen in primaries in other states, the same group who have, the RNC, who has funded their C3 arm, has been, it's alleged, has been sending out robocalls to specific communities, you can guess which ones, where they provide wrong election day information and polling site information so people get it wrong and don't vote. This is all to say, this is the election of our lives. And every election in the United States, it's the most important. This is the election of our lives. And we may not win, because it's also not a smart strategy to just focus on the presidential. We have to focus on Congress. We have to focus on who our governors are. Pay attention to our governors and how they responded to COVID. We have to focus on our school boards, on our community boards, on our city council, on our state government. Every level matters now, and don't wait for people to run, whether in the US or Germany. If you have an idea, and if you have the passion, and if you have a vision, do it. This is what Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has made very clear. There are people who are less qualified in office. So I share this because I think when we think about voting in the United States, we have to dare to dream big. What would universal voting look like? The day you're born, you're registered, right? Imagine if in the US we treated voting as a civic duty the same way we treat jury duty. We don't. So what's the message? We don't want you to vote. So, you know, I think it's gonna be an uphill battle. We are prepared, and every level of government matters. And protest is part of civic engagement. So.
Thank you so much for sharing. And people need to hear this more often, because thank you for your honest reply. And I see we're also running out of time, but you wanted to leave this on a positive note and share something, I guess.
For those who are willing to stay a little while, in spite of the work that I do, I'm still an artist. And I put a call out to all of our artists in the world, because this is a moment we want to make sure that our stories are documented, that our stories are told. And, you know, I don't know what you see on the news in Germany of what's happening, but one of the things you don't often see is the love and solidarity and interconnectedness of our communities, and understanding that if Black people win, we all win. So 2 Palestinian filmmakers in New York put together this amazing film teaser for their longer version. And I wanted to share that with all of you, because at the end of the day, the only thing that's going to get us through this is unity and imagination and a whole lot of hope. So Katharina, if you don't mind sharing the video.
Yes, let's do that. Can you see it?
The New York I dream of. New York I dream of? Yeah, that's a good one. That's a thought.
A city that unites together no matter what.
It's fair for all.
The New York I dream of is. Damn, I'm fucking blanking out.
Someplace where everyone can live peacefully. No one has to fear based on their race or their color or their gender or creed to be fearful of police. That has to stop.
A place where everyone has each other's back.
The New York I dream of is one where I feel comfortable having children as a Black woman.
The New York I dream of is part of a movement that's bigger than all of us. This is for our children, our children's children, our grandchildren, so they can have a better future.
Ponchos for the rain. Anybody want a poncho for the rain later? Yeah, free. We're not selling.
I want white people to understand they have to treat the people the same way.
People are discovering and embracing their power, but we need to work together, and I see it happening. There's sustained growth. People are starting to make noise in the right way. The message is going in a good direction. I'm feeling good. What do we want? What do we want? We are ready.
All right, thank you so much for sharing. And this was our series, Transatlantic Voices, Stimmen aus Amerika in Zeiten von Corona on Protests for Progress. Thank you very much, guys, for being here today. Marcela and Dillon, you rock. And thank you, everyone, for your interest and your great questions. So I just say, let's stay connected in these challenging times and be assured we will be back digitally and once time allows, again in presence. Until then, be safe, stay healthy, and have a great weekend. Goodbye, bye.
Bye, friends.
Bye.